Well, thank you for this hearing. As it was mentioned earlier, we had a budget meeting this morning. The head of the GAO came in and talked about the budget, the process, and we will see another estimate coming from them tomorrow on certain aspects of our federal spending. But I want to put this in perspective. I think the country faces two very serious crises right now, and they're interrelated. One is we've got a global security crisis. And I see it on several fronts, 5 major levels that we are facing as a country. One is we got the rise of traditional powers, Russia and China. Second, we have the terrorist rise. ISIS right now has relationships around the globe, and they have a reach around the globe that we just haven't seen in modern history. The third is this threat of nuclear proliferation among rogue nations. With the collaboration between North Korea and Iran right now, the JCPOA notwithstanding, they both are moving in that direction. The fourth is cyber. I mean, what we see going on in hybrid warfare right now with Russia's doing in Eastern Europe is profound. What we see in our own shores with cyber warfare is not to be ignored. And then last, the thing we don't really talk about is the arms race in space. So all of these things created a pressure on our ability to deal with the global security crisis. I just got back from a week in the Middle East, and I can tell you things are not getting better there. They're getting much worse on a humanitarian level as well as a security level. Development is taking a back seat. You talk about a middle class is evaporating in the Middle East. It's not just declining, it's evaporating. And 11 million people in Syria are on the road going somewhere. So we've got a huge problem there, and at the very time that we face this increasing threat to our country and the free world, by the way, we're spending less on our military than we have in 50 years as a percentage of GDP, 3.1%. If that were to compare to just the 30-year average, adjusted for taking the surge out, that's about 100 basis points less than the 30-year average, which is about $200 billion today. Now, I'm not espousing that we're spending $200 billion less. I'd like to see some efficiency made in the military, but I think it's really important to note that we are sitting on the smallest Army since World War II, the smallest Navy since World War I, and the oldest and smallest Air Force ever. And I just don't understand it. Even Secretary Gates, in his last budget, proposed for FY16, he proposed a budget that's some $66 billion greater than what we're spending right now. Those are real numbers, and I've just seen personally how it affects our ability to affect the mission we have. Let me give you just an example very quickly. In Morón, Spain, we stood up a year and a half ago a Marine contingent to defend our embassies in Africa. That's their only mission in life. They have 12 Osprey V-22 airplanes. They're self-contained, they're mobile, they can get there in a matter of hours. The problem is, by having 12 planes over there and the delay in buying future V-22s, we now have to move 6 planes back. That cuts their ability in half. That means they can only defend one embassy at a time in Africa. Now, what that means is, if someone has a minor incident and they mobilize and go down to them, effectively what we need to do in most other embassies is evacuate, because we don't have the ability to back up our defense. We can talk about JSTARS, we can talk about the human capital issue, but I think the bottom line is that we have increased threats. We have a question about, are we spending in the right priorities to defend our country and really to protect alliances around the world. At the same time then, as you have a global security crisis, you've got a debt crisis. Now, I'm sorry, I'm just a business guy, but here are the realities. I mean, I don't understand why this is even the debate. Honest to God, I don't. I mean, $19 trillion of debt. We talk about 75% of GDP. I feel like the federal government owes Social Security and they owe the trust fund and Medicare those dollars. Those are not to be ignored. So I talk about it being over 100% of GDP today, and over $100 trillion of future unfunded liabilities that nobody wants to talk about. The interest rate today is so arbitrary. 7 years we have not adjusted interest rate. We had one in December. It's the first time the Fed has adjusted interest rates in 7 years. Unprecedented. And that quarter-point interest, or increase in the interest rate, effectively means $50 billion each year of new interest. $50 billion. Imagine what that would do to AIDS. Imagine what that would do to Alzheimer's or cancer research, or to help build the middle class with economic development. Ms. Tannen, I agree 100%. Our goal right now is to build the middle class. It's under great jeopardy. It's in great jeopardy. Our economy is suffering through the worst recovery in 70 years. I understand the number of months of positive GDP growth, et cetera, but there's no denying this economy is sitting down. $4.5 trillion the Fed's put into the economy. It's not working. Why? Because of our fiscal policies from this place here in Washington. I'm a business guy. I can go on all day about why this economy is not growing. But I want to get to the question very quickly. In the last 7 years, Dr. Haas, we've borrowed 35% of what we spent as a federal government. We spent $25 trillion running the government. We borrowed $9 trillion. In the next 10 years, the CBO says we're going to add another $9 trillion of debt, which is about 25% of what we'll spend. So the bottom line, it says that mandatory spending is 70% of our budget. That means that every dollar we spend on discretionary money, spending, that's military and non-military discretion, in my definition is borrowed, because the first dollars that come in go to mandatory. We can't sustain that. There is no way this is sustainable. This is not, you have the best characterizations I've heard, and I want you to expound on it. It's a slow motion crisis. I've never heard anybody else talk about that. But you said the bad news is that slow motion crises generate little or no sense of priority, but rather tend to promote complacency. Combine that with political gridlock here in Washington, you can see why the approval rating in this body is 7%. You can see why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are doing what they're doing in the presidential race. So my question is, as an outside advisor, how do we break through to create the sense of urgency? And are we charting the right course relative to debt being a threat to national security from a foreign policy? This is a bipartisan committee. I think we find common ground that economically we want to help the middle class. But I think the realization that we've got to come to is that this is not just a crisis for our kids and grandkids. I'm telling you right now, it's here right now. So I'm asking you as an advisor who has a picture of this thing, if interest rates were to go up to their 50-year average of 5%, we'd be paying $1 trillion in interest. There is physically no way on a $4 trillion budget to do that. So please help us with some advice about how to break through here.
I feel like the kid in class who just got asked the toughest question. Let me say, I'll pick up one thing on what you said, and then I'll do my best to answer it. I think it's important, it gets a little bit back at one of the previous exchanges, we're not just like everybody else. We have responsibilities in the world. To say that we've come out of the recession slightly better than others, or our demographic picture is not as bad as others, that doesn't give me a lot of comfort. We have a role in the world which is qualitatively different. And there's no other country that plays such a role in the world to promote global order. And there's no alternative to us. This is not bragging. This is not saying we can do it alone. But we do have a unique role. So we've got to have capacities that others don't have to have. The dollar plays a role that no other currency plays. So the U.S. is a model that no other country is. So I think the United States is to some extent sui generis. And it's one of the reasons the debt problem and the trajectory worries me so much. I don't think it's fair or smart to say we're better off than others. The question is whether we are and we're heading where we need to be.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're also subsidizing our allies who are spending, on average, much less than 2% on a GDP as well on military.
True, but also, I think it's also, when it comes to allies, we have to remind ourselves that one of the reasons we support our allies is not as a favor to them, it's a favor to ourselves. And I believe we've gotten an extraordinary return on our investment in Europe and in Asia.
I agree.
So and when I look at the history of the last 75 years, essentially it's a remarkable history from the vantage point of American national security, both what's happened and what hasn't happened. And one of the reasons is that we have been so supportive of our allies. To answer your question, though, about how we change the conversation, I actually think it's part of a larger conversation, sir. And I think it's part of a conversation about where we take some of these issues like debt and we connect it to national security, which is the logic of this hearing today, and where I think we basically have to do a larger, pardon the expression, public education role about why the world matters, how it affects us, and how the future of this country, what happens, if you will, to the 320 million Americans, how it is not something that we alone are going to determine. We are going to be dramatically and directly affected by what happens amongst the other 95% of the people in the world, about what happens in questions of regional stability, the ability of the globe to deal with some of the challenges you mentioned, from cyber to proliferation. So I think the reason, the way to have an informed public debate on the consequences of our debt and its trajectory for national security is really to embed it in a larger debate about the consequences of what happens in the world for the welfare, the prosperity, the security of the United States. What worries me is Americans often just don't see the connections between what goes on out there and what goes on and will go on here. And I think it is actually a public educational challenge for people in your position, for people in mine and others.
Thank you.
May I respond?
Please.
Just briefly? I do just want to make the broader connection between the decisions Congress makes or can make and the issue of economic growth. So just as an example, investments in infrastructure, large-scale investments in infrastructure generally, as you see in other countries, improve productivity of the economy, help foster economic growth. So I again want to say I absolutely agree that we do have to address the long-term debt in the United States. We should do that in a reasonable way, and I would agree with Ambassador Haas that there are ways to do that. The question I pose is, for the decisions that Congress is making today, I also think we have to think about how the decisions you're making are affecting economic growth, productivity, and in issues like investments we can make in infrastructure, for example, where there has been bipartisan support, and I believe continues to be bipartisan support. That is an area in which you make an investment, it actually improves productivity, and it, over the long run, helps you address your challenges around deficits and debt. The stronger the economy is, the faster it is, the more heat there is to the economy. That does affect our debt numbers as well. And I just would point out that there are decisions we all make today that can have that kind of impact.
May I just quickly?
Sure.
Sorry. I couldn't agree more. We've been looking for common ground, and here it is. There is an interconnectivity between growing the economy and the debt. You're not going to solve the debt crisis over the next 30 years just by growing the economy. But you're not going to do it without doing it as well. I mean, you have to deal with Social Security and Medicare, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which also affects the economy itself. The drain on resources to support that takes away from investments in infrastructure. We see it right now in this very budget that we're dealing with today. So I see this as a very major part of a long-term plan. You said it best, Dr. Haas. This is not something that's going to be solved with next year's budget. We've got here over 70 years. It's going to take, well, actually in the last 15 years is when we created it. In the year 2000, we had $6 trillion of debt. Under the Bush administration, we added 4, it went to 10. Now we're up to 19. There are no innocent parties up here. We're all guilty of this. Somebody said in a testimony, he said, we've seen the enemy and it's you guys, talking about us, and it's right. So the way out of here, I believe, is to save Social Security and Medicare, get the economy growing, solve this budget process, fix that, and get at the underlying cost of health care, which is driving the Medicare costs so dramatically. So I think there's common ground here. In this committee, what I'm worried about is the interconnectivity with this national security issue that we have as a nation, and to fulfill our mission around the world to protect our national interests, but also our security here at home. Thank you both.
Before